Welcome to the final episode of a special 5-part election series where I have covered some of the most important issues surrounding the presidential race with a local political expert. Today we're exploring foreign policy and how the two candidates will approach the complex conflicts taking place all around the world. This is 62% of total voters, with 54% of Harris voters and 70% of Trump voters. I think that despite the difference in language and sometimes posturing, both candidates have a relatively similar stance on the conflict in Israel. Trump perhaps more staunchly pro-Israel, but based on the actions of what we've seen from the current administration, it seems like maybe not the biggest impact either way on that issue. I think where you see a bit more difference is in Ukraine. I think obviously the Biden administration has been very clear on wanting to continue to give aid to the Ukrainian people and continue to give aid to all NATO allies across the world. This is something that Harris has been very clear about wanting to continue, and that is where her and Trump seem to differ a lot.
For years, we were paying almost all of NATO. We were being ripped off by European nations, both on trade and on NATO.
And then, of course, there's kind of also this just looming another horizon impending doom issue of China, which Trump, a bit more stern, seems to be very much in favor of trade wars and kind of openly big time tariffs and all that type of stuff, whereas Harris, again, similar to Biden in a sense where I kind of look at it as a cordial but definitely not friendly relationship, where I think we understand that because of the size of our two economies, trade is going to happen. It's implicitly there. But there is obviously some human rights things and different issues that I think our government has tried their best to tiptoe. Maybe not always to the greatest success, but I'm curious overall with all of those are kind of the big three issues in my opinion on foreign policy. Where are we at in the election with both candidates?
So when it comes to China, one of the things that Trump did during his administration is he imposed a lot of tariffs as a way of sort of constraining China's behavior. And the Harris campaign has been very critical of the use of tariffs. But the reality is that when President Biden came in, many of those tariffs remained the same, right? And so whereas Trump has talked about concern about China and their growing influence, you're right, the Biden campaign has been worried about that as well. And so they've negotiated alliances with people in that part of the countries in that part of the world as a sort of to bolster their defense against China. And so they both express concern about the growth of China, and I think almost everybody agrees with that. When it comes to Israel, I think the biggest difference, I think you're right that both sides have a pro-Israeli stance. What I haven't heard as much from former President Trump that I have heard from Vice President Harris is any kind of expression of concern for the plight of the Palestinian people. Now, and I've spoken with many people about this, they'll say, yeah, they give lip service to the people of Gaza and then they ship the bombs to Israel, right? So from the perspective of some people, this is a distinction without a difference. I'm not sure I completely agree with that, because what's happening in Gaza, I think, is objectively horrific. Regardless of what people think about Israel, the events of October 7th, what's going on in Gaza is horrific. And so when Trump fails to seem to acknowledge that, or when he does acknowledge it, he does so in terms of its bad PR strategy. It's not about human suffering. It's about Netanyahu's making himself look bad. I think that does send a message.
They're losing the PR war, and they're losing it big. But they've got to finish what they started, and they got to finish it fast, and we have to get on with life.
It sends a message to our allies. It sends a message to the people in the Middle East. But I understand the complaints of people who say this is a distinction without a difference. Ukraine, as you correctly point out, there's a sharp difference. But it's not just about Ukraine. That's certainly important. Trump says, if he was president, it never would have happened. Nobody can say that. There's no way to know that.
If I were president, Russia would have never,
ever, I know Putin very well, he would have never, and there was no threat of it either, by the way, for 4 years, have gone into Ukraine.
But he doesn't seem to have the revulsion of the invasion that you hear on the Harris campaign. But it also speaks not only to what's going on in Ukraine, but how he views international alliances, in particular NATO. I would argue that NATO has been instrumental in maintaining the security both globally, but especially in Europe. And what's happened during the Biden administration is they did a great deal to expand NATO. Trump doesn't seem to be as interested in that. So where the differences in Ukraine are significant and important, they speak to a bigger issue.
Just going back to Israel, you had discussed that there is kind of this tough issue for some members of the Democratic Party to reckon with, and for some it even seems to be like a top issue to where it could be a withholding vote situation depending on how it develops leading up to the election with what Harris promises to do and maybe more importantly not do when it comes to Israel.
Right, and I think that's one of the challenges that the Harris campaign is dealing with, is that there are people, like there's a large Muslim population in Michigan, one of the battleground states. And so there are a bunch of people who say there is no difference between what Trump is talking about and what Harris is talking about. They're all pro-Israel. They're all happy about sending bombs. So the challenge on the part of the Harris campaign is to communicate in a way that they find believable, a deep concern about the plight of the Palestinian people. How do they reckon with that? The problem is that anybody who is so bothered by what's going on in Gaza, it's hard to fault them for that. What's going on is horrific. The amount of deaths, the innocent loss of life, and the seeming intractable nature of that war. And now that it's expanding into Lebanon as well, it's understandable why some people are single issue voters. I don't think they're going to be able to get through. My personal belief is that I think there is a real difference between Harris and Trump. I think Trump wouldn't put any restraints on Netanyahu. I think they agree. They have that similar approach. And so I would argue to people who are concerned about that, yeah, I get it. I understand that you're dissatisfied with the Harris campaign. But if Trump wins, at least as it pertains to Israel, you can anticipate a even less restrained Israel. It's hard to imagine a less restrained Israel, but if you can envision a less restrained Israel, I think that that's what a Trump campaign and a Trump victory would produce.
Reporting for Canyons News, I'm Eli Kern.